All right, we're recording. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, David. Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. You reached out to me a few weeks ago, I believe, and I was like, "Holy cow, this dude's story!" Like you, well, for one, I love it when somebody reaches out and they give me all the details, and you didn't hold back whatsoever. You told me pretty much your whole story, and I thought it was interesting. So here we are doing the interview. Thanks again.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, let's kind of talk about like who you are, where you're from, and then we'll talk about your story a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I'm living in North Carolina right now in a town called Hillsborough, which is in the Triangle. It's very close to Durham and Chapel Hill and Raleigh. I'm here with my wife, and we moved here. Well, I'm thinking 13 years ago now, and I she and I both grew up in and around New York City. In 1988, we moved from New York to Houston, Texas, and that was a job opportunity for me. And we were there for 11 years. Our son was born down there. And then for another job opportunity, moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we're there for 12 years, I think. And then again for another job opportunity, came down here to Hillsborough, and we've been here since. And this will be the final stop, as far as I know.
um, I'm not sure how far away from Charlotte, North Carolina, are you?
We're a couple of hours.
Okay,
It's a couple hours of highway driving. Lately, I've had the itch to go on a train trip. It's about 2.5 hours by train.
okay. So I have family that live in Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is
Yeah,
just south of Charlotte. Um,
exactly.
and it's a beautiful, beautiful area. I
It
love.
sure is. Yeah, Rock Hill is real pretty. You go down on the highway, and there's just a great entranceway into the area. Big brick and engraved
Yeah,
concrete sign announcing Rock Hill. It's really pretty down there.
it is. I mean, all of the Carolinas are beautiful. Anytime I drive through, I'm like, oh, I want to live down here.
Yeah, well, it's funny when we lived in New York, and this goes back to 1988. I wasn't quite 40 years old, and somehow we were already thinking about, when we retire, where will we go? And the Carolinas were always kind of on the top of the list. And here, yeah, quite by accident, here we are.
Well, it's a beautiful place to retire at. I mean, I know my family that they're from Indianapolis, and her my cousin's husband had I believe a job opportunity in the Carolinas, so that's why they moved.
Yeah,
Um,
interestingly, I'm going down yes, it's the first weekend in March to do a book reading in a place called Lumberton, North Carolina, and it's a building that some folks from Indianapolis took over. They came down to get closer to family and saw a real estate opportunity and a business opportunity. So I think people are heading to the coast.
I mean, it's got to be cheaper, right? Slightly cheaper than like moving to Florida or something. And
Yeah, I think the real estate market has been all over the board in the past 10 years. I think after that big meltdown in 2008, you could have bought half of Florida for what a house in Florida costs now.
oh,
But
absolutely.
yeah, then they had this big real estate resurgence there, and we've seen it right here in North Carolina with our own home. The we finally had a good real estate investment.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so we're real pleased, and we love the area. We're about halfway between the mountains and the beach, so
Mm.
yeah, it couldn't be better.
Yeah, that's so desirable, especially being from the Midwest. I mean, I'm in Michigan, so
Uh,
the closest body of water is the Great Lakes, and you don't want to go there in the wintertime.
no, I know, boy. That's when I took my job down here in North Carolina. I'd been looking for a while, and I interviewed for a job in Michigan right
Wow.
about the same time. And yeah, not that, no offense to the folks from Michigan, but I'm glad to be in North Carolina, just based on weather.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you can't beat the warm weather. And then you still also have your climates too.
Oh,
So
we've got seasons here, sure.
yeah.
Today I'm just looking by computer. It's 40 degrees right now. It's 40 and it's cloudy, and we've had a little bit of rain, but
That's ideal.
Last week the temperatures got up into the 60s, and the week before that they were down in the teens. So kind
Very
of
cool.
all over the map.
Very cool. Now, I kind of want to get into your story a little bit.
Yeah,
Where where did it come from? Why did you? Well, I guess I'm trying to figure out how I want to take the interview
yeah,
because the listeners don't know anything about you. So let's kind of backtrack a little bit. What
sure.
led to you writing
I,
your
as I said, I was born in New York City, and I'm approaching my 76th birthday right now. So I was born in 1948, and somewhere probably the time I was 6, 7 years old, I discovered that I was adopted. And it was not through a conversation that I had with my adoptive parents, but just from kind of rummaging through their papers one day they were out and I was home, and I don't know what led me to do that, but I found an envelope in a folder that my mother had. And when I opened it up, there were two pieces of paper. And, really, I didn't intellectually understand what they were until much later. But one turned out to be my adoption decree, and one of them turned out to be my amended birth certificate, which essentially said, that my adoptive parents were my parents. And I was adopted. I was taken home from the hospital at a day old.
wow.
Uh, New York laws required that I could not, or the adoption could not be finalized until 18 months later. And in that interim period, I was the foster child of my future adoptive parents.
Okay. Wow. And so you were 6 years old when you found that out.
Yeah, yeah. And
What was, what was the conversation like once your parents found out you knew?
David, to the best of my knowledge or the best of my recollection, there never was a conversation. As a kid, I think I was thinking, if they're not talking about this, then I guess I shouldn't ask about it. And I never did.
Really?
So, to the time my dad passed away in the 1970s, and my mother in the 1980s, we never had a conversation. But I just went through my life knowing. And, you and I talked in the past. I had what was essentially an idyllic childhood. Whether I was adopted or I was naturally born, I don't think it could have been much better. And I just never had a need to know.
Wow. That's that's crazy. I mean, because I'm looking at your situation as if it were me, and I knew I was adopted,
Yeah. Yep.
but like it's crazy. My dynamics are crazy because like I have a good relationship with my adopted dad, not my adopted mom. They got divorced and it's a whole other
Right.
thing.
Sure.
But prior or after that, him and I have a great relationship, almost like how you just described. He's my dad essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't look at him any different.
And
Um,
I never looked at my adoptive parents as anything but my parents. And I think probably that, in my case anyway, was a case of the fact that they took me home at a day old. So,
mm,
there was never, there was a separation from my birth mother, certainly, but they were the only people I ever knew. And they treated me as the only child they ever knew.
wow. I mean, that's beautiful because I mean, like I was getting to with my own situation and many other people that I've had on the podcast that have been in the foster care system or have been adopted or even in the foster care system.
Right.
They have a desire to know who they are and know like where they came from, especially once they find out that they're adopted.
Yeah.
And
Go on. I'm sorry.
so like for me, when I felt like I had to go search. I had to do whatever I could to learn that about myself.
I think in my case there was a differentiation between curiosity. I wonder who would give up a child and why, and a need to know. And probably once, twice a year for the duration of my life, I would periodically think, I wonder what the circumstances were, and I wonder why. And then I just sort of go back to normal day by day life, and it wasn't anything that was really compelling me to go out and look.
Right, right. Did you feel like you would be doing your adopted family a disservice by going and looking?
No, I really never did. As I said, I had the infrequent curiosity, but again, no desire or nothing that was
Yeah.
compelling me to look. So that really didn't even come into play.
So how did
And
you Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in retrospect, had I chosen to do it earlier while my parents were alive, I tend to think they would have been quite supportive. I know my mother would have been. My father, I think, would have been helpful, but he may have wondered, after everything we've given you, why are you doing this?
Mm,
I don't think it would have been resentment. It just would have been, yeah, what else could we have done that you wouldn't want to do this?
right. Well, I don't think it's necessarily something like you're taken away from anybody. It's just you wanna know. It's the curiosity
Yeah,
factor.
yeah,
And that's what it was for me when I found my biological mom, and then a couple of years later, I found my biological father.
right.
My biological dad, or not, my adopted dad, I remember having a conversation with him. He was like, I'm sad about this because I feel like now we're gonna lose you." And I'm like, "You don't have to look at it that way. You look at it as if, like, now I'm finding somebody else that also loves me. So I just have an extra person who loves me. It
Yeah,
doesn't change."
you've got more in your life. You've got
Right.
your family just got bigger.
Right, exactly. Now, when did you start the search for your story, and what was the reasoning for that? And then what led to you wanting to write the book?
Well, it was 2017, and 2 years before, we had my wife's parents moved down here from New Jersey. Yeah, they were getting on in years, and they arrived here both in compromised health. My mother-in-law passed away not too long after they were here. 6 months later, my father-in-law passed away, and we were back in New Jersey to inter their remains. And near the cemetery where we were doing that was another cemetery, a Russian Orthodox cemetery, and it was where the extended family of my adoptive mother was buried. My adoptive mother came from a Ukrainian family.
Mm,
So we were there thinking, well, we may never be back to New Jersey again, or not, at least not in a situation where we would be going visiting cemeteries. So we were there, and we kind of went grave to grave, and I had my recollections of people who I called aunt or uncle, even though they were really my mother's cousins.
mm,
But that's, I had seen them as my aunts and uncles as I had grown up as a child. And we finally got down to the gravestone of my adoptive mother's parents. So my maternal adoptive grandparents. And I was standing there and thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of have some background about, where they came from before they got to the United States. I know they both got there right around the turn of the 20th century. And that curiosity was kind of being led by a book I had been reading, or I was reading then, either second, third time, written by an author who had gone to search for the history of some extended relatives who had perished in the Holocaust. And he had known that they perished. It was fairly obvious, but he wanted to know the specifics. And yeah, he was a fairly well-known writer. He was an academic, and he traveled around the world twice in a 4-year period, searching for the fate of those people. And he ultimately found them, or
wow.
found each one's story. And so that book had sort of, tickled my imagination a little bit.
What was
And I
the
was
name of the
sitting,
book?
the book is called The Search for Six of 6 Million.
Okay.
And it's written by an author by the name of Daniel Mendelsohn. And, so I was in the midst of reading it again. And I was thinking, okay, if he could, go through all of that and find out specifically what happened to those people, how hard could it be for me to start finding out the history of, these people whose grave I was standing over? So when I got back home to North Carolina, I went to our local library. I went out to ancestry.com. And it was also the ancestry advertising that I've been seeing on TV that had, made me think, okay, maybe this is an easier search than it might have been 10 years ago. And there were TV shows on at that point, The Long Lost Family and Family Search, things like that, as well as recreational DNA testing. So, that sort of said, okay, maybe this window is a little bit wider open than it's been in the past. And I went to the library, got onto Ancestry, typed in my grandparents' names, and came back with a relative wealth of information about when they arrived, where they went. They had moved to the Lower East Side in Manhattan, which is where many immigrants moved at that time period. And then they moved uptown a little bit, and from there they moved still farther uptown. Ultimately, bought a piece of property out on Long Island in New York, and that was where I knew them and knew their history. And something just sort of clicked in that moment as I looked at their information, saying, if it's this easy to find them, I wonder how hard it would be to find the woman who placed me for adoption. And I still had that envelope that my birth mother, or my adoptive mother, had kept with the adoption decree
Wow.
and with the amended birth certificate. And I remembered there was a signature on the adoption decree and a name that as a kid I never recognized. And intuitively I knew that's got to be my birth mother. So I sort of like folded up my things, hustled home, went and got that envelope out, and sure enough, there's the name. And I wrote that down and ran right back to the library with it again and typed in the name. And there's a kind of a hesitancy to hit the enter key and say, is this something I really want to do? And I did it. And I got that same screen full of different documents that were available to me. And the one that I clicked on first was I chose it by the one that was closest to when I was born. I was born in May of 48. There was a document from March of 1949, and it was a travel visa or a visa application traveling from the United States to Rio de Janeiro.
Oh.
I, I found that in itself perplexing, but I clicked on it, and there's a whole bunch of information, the same name. And I found out that, she appeared to have grown up in the not very far from where I grew up. And, I'd always thought she was the high school girl who, quote unquote, got into trouble and was sent away. But in fact, she was 23 years old when I was born. And it listed an occupation as the application was written in Portuguese because everyone in Rio or in Brazil spoke Portuguese.
Mm.
But the information was all completed in English, with the exception of it listed her, excuse me, her occupation as an artista, which didn't help me very much, but at least I knew she was not a high school girl. I knew she had an occupation, but I wondered what that was all about. But the really aha moment was part of that application was there's a picture of my birth mother. So I'm sitting there in the library looking at the screen and she's looking back at me. And probably, with all of the different revelations and surprises that I've had during the course of the journey, that was the biggest ones, just to see her face there. And and that really at that point spurred the journey. And when I began it, I said, well, if I found out that my birth mother worked at the local Five and Dime or the post office or someplace like that, that would be fine. That's probably where the journey would have ended. and the search, because yeah, I would have known. I would have known where I came from, who I came from, and what her life afterwards was like. But now I had that artista piece, and that was a hook that said, "You've got to look farther."
So, what did you do next? Well, how did you discover who she was?
Well, having that whole list of documents here, first I hustled home to show my wife the picture. I said, "Hey, you've got to see this. I've got a picture of my mother." And and she, my birth mother, and my adoptive mother were very close. And she said, "We've got all sorts of pictures of your mother." I said, "No, not this mother. Here's my birth mother." And she was as equally drawn into the search at that point as I was. The next day, I went back to the library, typed the name back into Ancestry, and started looking at other documents. And I found a marriage license from 7 years after I was born. I was born in 48. She married in 1955. And I had known from the amended birth certificate there was no father listed. So I really had no thought that, yeah, that there was a relationship or a serious one that had taken place. So she married in 1955. So I pulled up that license, and it had three names to work with now: her birth name, her married name, and another name, which was her birth name was Narowski. She came from an immigrant Polish family. And she married a man by the name of Ted Meza. And there was this other name was kind of perplexing, which was Naras. But now I had her, all these names, and it also said that their occupations, both of their occupations, were performers. So I started kind of mixing and matching names with performer. And I went out to Google with that, and in fairly short order came up with a hit on a online newspaper that was edited by an antiques dealer in South Carolina. And she said that she had been to an auction in Atlanta, Georgia in 2012, and had bought some very big folk art pieces, which had previously been manufactured as props for ice skating and theatrical events and commercial use. And she explained that Genevieve and Ted Meza, who had both been ice skaters with various ice skating troops, had retired in 1956 to Georgia and created a company where they manufactured props for the ice skating shows. Subsequently, for the theatrical events, like the Broadway premiere of Hello Dolly, the 1961 presentation of the Miss America contest. And it explained that Genevieve had adopted the screen name, or the stage name, Naras, when she began her career as an ice skater.
Wow.
So now I've got, okay, Genevieve Naras, ice skater. I went back to Google again, put that in, and bingo, hit another blog, which was by an antiques dealer who had been at the same auction.
Huh.
And that blog had half a dozen promotional photographs of my mother. It posted her middle school, high school diploma. It posted her first professional contract. And the person who posted it explained that we were at an auction, she and her husband. We saw these items, and not knowing who the woman was, but thinking it was a glamorous period and the woman herself was glamorous, we bought this box of ephemera, where the first person had bought very, very big pieces to resell. They had bought these smaller pieces because that's what they dealt in, small items that they could also resell. So I'm, 2017, as I'm looking at this 5 years later, I'm thinking if she's an antiques dealer, it's not very likely that she still had them, but maybe she had some of them or some part of them. So I got on Facebook and started looking for, she her name was there, and I found two people with the same name, one on the West Coast, another one in Marietta, Georgia, which essentially is a suburb of Atlanta, and she identified herself as affiliated with an antiques mall in Georgia. And I said, got to be the person. So I contacted her through Facebook, and all I said is I saw your blog and I'm exploring a possible family relationship. I think I may be related to this person. By any chance, do you still have any of these items? And if you do, would you get back to me when you have time? And probably 10 minutes later, I got a message back. And she said, I'm really, really busy now. I wanted to let you know I've got all of these items,
Wow.
but I'll have to, I'll get back to you in a little while. Yeah, she was babysitting grandchildren. So I sort of sat by the computer and by the phone thinking a little while was a little while, and 7 days later, when she hadn't contacted me, I reached out again, and this time I said, the woman whose pictures you posted online gave me up at the time of my birth in 1948. And I know you're busy, but when you have a chance, would you please call me? And within 5 minutes, the phone rang. And she apologized, said, I am so sorry. I just forgot all about it. And this is really exciting. You've got to come to Georgia right now. which, which was a little, a little urgent, and I figured that right now was sort of the same thing as I get back to you soon. But a week later, my wife and I traveled to Atlanta and we made arrangements to meet them. They came to our hotel and she came walking in first with this carton in her arms. And we've still got the carton. And I know it's the one that she purchased in at that auction. She said, well, Dan is parking the car, but he'll be in soon. And he came in about 5 minutes later with a sword and a shield, sort of like Teenage Mutant Ninja like. And I've got them hanging on the wall just outside this room. And they were part of the props that my mother and her husband had created for some event. And we spent probably 4 hours with these folks and just going through the box piece by piece by piece. And it was kind of an overwhelming thing. They were as excited as we were, I think.
Yeah.
And at one point, I was taking notes of names. There were a stack of headshots of other ice skaters, and each one was autographed with some inscription to my mother. So I'm writing names down, thinking, okay, if I can contact somebody, maybe they could tell me more about my mother, especially back in that period. And as I was doing that down, the husband said, what are you doing? And I explained, I said, I'm thinking if I could find these names, maybe somebody could give me more information. He said, yeah, he said, skip to taking the notes. And he kind of pushed the carton across the table. He said, this is yours. We've just been holding it for you.
Wow.
And, and that was just one of so many acts of generosity that we encountered during this search. And ultimately, I went through that stack of photographs name by name by name. And remember, these women would have been late in their 80s, early in their 90s. And, some I found were deceased. Some I just could not find at all. And miraculously, the last woman had endorsed the photograph as to the best roommate ever, love Izzy. And there's print at the bottom. Her name was Isabel Smith. And I went online looking for Isabel Smith, and there would be no name other than Smith that could have been any less likely you would find anybody. But I ultimately found an obituary for a man who had recently passed away. And at the bottom of the obituary, it said he was survived by his wife, Isabel, wife of 55, 60 years, former ice skater with Ice Follies. And I
Wow.
knew by that point that my mother had been in Ice Follies, and it gave the names of two sons. I could not find any contact information for Isabel. I found contact information for one of the sons in Minnesota. So I made a photostat of one of my mother's photos, the photostat of the picture of his mother, hand wrote a letter to him saying, here's what's going on. I said, yeah, I realize, this may be a touchy subject, but I was wondering if your mom is still alive. And about a week later, the phone rang and it's the son, and he was all excited and saying, Mom is alive. And I showed her the pictures, and she's all excited and she would love to talk to you. And I said, that's great. And I was all excited. And he said, there's just one thing I need to tell you. Mom is in a memory care facility. And so he must have felt that I was kind of deflating. And he said, but don't worry. He said, Mom has no clue what she had for breakfast this morning, but she can tell you 1947 minute for minute.
Wow.
So he gave me the contact information, and I called her, and I went from the switchboard to the nurse in her area, and the nurse said, hold on, let me get her for you. And she and I spoke for the better part of an hour and had a wonderful conversation. And the cute part was, I started saying, I apologize. I realize it's unfair to ask somebody who's 92 years old what happened in 1947. And she immediately said, who told you I'm 92? I said, oh, I'm sorry. And I just sort of waited. She said, I'm 88. And she said, as a matter of fact, I'm 85. And I'm doing the math really quick. I knew she was not 85, but we went on. We had a nice conversation. And toward the end of the conversation, I said, if I can rustle up the airline miles and the hotel points, do you think maybe I could come and visit? And she said, I would love that. I said, that's great. She said, now, how old did you say you were? And I said, well, I'm going to be 69. She said, well, I'm 65, So, so she was really cute. And my wife and I did go out there a few months later, and we spent almost 5 hours with her, with
Wow.
she and her son, and had a wonderful conversation. And she was not able to tell me a lot of detail, but she said, I cannot believe, the kind of skating your mother did if she knew that she was pregnant with you. Yeah,
Wow.
my mother was what you called an adagio skater. And in music, adagio means slow. In ice skating, it apparently means, you get lifted and thrown and spin and spun.
Oh,
And,
wow.
she said it would have been like you were in some kind of a,
Like a roller coaster or
yeah,
carnival.
yeah, pretty much. And I knew, but my mother had to know she was pregnant while she was still doing this. And, and she was able to tell me lots about my mother personality wise, and the kind of person she was. She said, I had no idea she was pregnant.
Wow.
But it was a wonderful conversation. We talked to her again afterwards, and sadly a couple of years ago she passed away, but she was 98 or 99 years old by that point,
Wow.
and bright and alert, and it was a wonderful relationship. So that was just, again, it was just one of those kind of serendipitous events as we went through this search.
It seems like everything just kind of fell in place as you went along. I mean, it's so crazy. That is so crazy.
David,
And
it almost unfairly fell into place. You hear what people go through trying to mine a nugget of information, and I have the greatest respect for what people go through in their searches and in their emotions. And this was just like one after another. The dominoes kind of just ticked over in perfect order.
yeah. That
even
is
from people that you would least expect to know anything or to care. Everybody was just respectful and helpful, and where they could help, they helped.
that's one thing I realized during my journey is most people they want you to know. They want you if you're looking and you're searching, they want to be able to help you, and they
And I
wanna
think
be a part
people
of
want
that.
to be part of a story too.
Yeah.
It's just human nature.
Yeah, but it's a success story. I mean, essentially, you were successful in learning who she was.
Yeah, I was very successful, and I'll give you two examples. I did ultimately learn that my birth mother had passed away before I began this search. I started it in 2017. She passed away at the age of 88 in 2014. I encountered one person. I, I am in reunion with a maternal half brother,
Wow.
and he has had, I believe, three wives. The first wife and he parted under not good circumstances, and I quite by accident encountered an uncle, I believe, of his first wife. And, I would not have expected him to have any high regard. But when he heard my story, he was utterly helpful, telling me, he actually put me in touch with the person who had been listed on that blog that I referenced, who was a good friend of my half brother, and he's the one who put us in touch. So he was helpful. Um, when I learned that my mother was not alive, there was part of me that very much wanted to know where she was buried. And yes, I searched cemetery records that were available online, and some were, but in the area, most were not. So I just picked the largest local cemetery and I reached out there, and, found, the phone was answered by a woman who turned out to be the superintendent of cemeteries for like four regional cemeteries. And she said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. She's not buried here. And she said, what's the relationship and why you're looking? And I told her my story, and she reached out to the other cemeteries and then cemeteries beyond her jurisdiction, trying to help me. And then it ultimately came back and said, I'm sorry, I came up with a dead end, but I really did try. And again, this is a person who had nothing vested in this.
All right. We're back. So, she reached out to other cemeteries, far and wide, and did they
Came
come up
up
with
with
something?
nothing.
Nothing. So did the son know anything? The half stepson, or is it her stepson?
No, it was her natural son by the man
Um,
she married in 1955. So it was her first son from that marriage.
So did he know anything?
Well, it was kind of interesting. He and I were. It took a while to make connection with him and to get into reunion. He had a very hard time getting his head around the fact of what I was telling him. He on three different occasions said, "Now tell me, what kind of kin are we?"
Oh,
And I would explain, and he was not. Yeah, he was not pushing back on me. It just didn't click with him. And I would tell him that you and I have different fathers, but you and I share the same mother. And he would shake his head and said, that can't be. I said, my mama and daddy were always together, and mama would have told me.
wow.
And I'm thinking to myself, that's not the type of thing, a mother would tell their son. But eventually, when I telling you, I was in reunion with my maternal half brother, and it took a little bit of work to get in touch with him or to locate him. Um, he had he was resistant, I guess, to to the idea that he and I were half brothers. He just could not fathom that his mother and father had not always been together, and that his mother would not have told him if she had had a child previous to her marriage. But ultimately, I showed him the adoption decree, and once he saw his mother's signature on it, and she had a very distinctive signature, he understood. It took him a couple of more days to digest it, but he was fine, and we talk frequently now, and it's he's good, and we'll actually be going down to visit with him in March. He lives south of Atlanta. Um, so you had asked about locating the place where my mother was interred. My brother and I had a couple of casual-ish conversations, kind of getting to know you type of things. And then one day I finally asked him, I said, where is our mother buried? And he kind of, he gave me kind of a hesitant answer with, well, she's with daddy. I said, okay, well, where are they? And there's a little bit of hesitation again. He said, well, they're in the closet.
Ooh.
And as it turned out, his father passed away in 1994. And I assume that, our mother thinking that, maybe they would be interred together, said, let's hold on to his ashes until I pass away, and then we can both be interred together. By the time she passed away in 2014, I think there were some economic issues which allowed for her to be cremated, but my yeah, not allowed for burial.
Right.
So I was happy to know where the remains were, because there had been some kind of crazy moves on my brother's part in the interim. But I was glad to know that, at least they were on the shelf in the closet. And I waited a little bit until the relationship had seasoned a little bit more, developed a little bit more. And in the meantime, I made some phone calls to cemeteries to kind of, to get a feel for what would it cost to inter them. And one day I just asked him, I said, how would you feel if, Linda is my wife, if we paid for the interment, and and, and he it turned out to be that he was very enthusiastic about that. Yeah, he wanted that at the time. He just could not afford to do it. And
Right.
he actually, we found a cemetery nearby where they had a columbarium. It's big wall with crypts that you could put the remains into. And Ted actually made a very, very nice wooden container that both of the sets of ashes could go into. And uh, I guess this is the summer before COVID broke out, so it would have been 2019. We went down to Georgia. We got a Catholic priest to come out to the cemetery, and had a religious interment. It was myself, my wife, and my son. Ted's friend who had put us together, and Ted's wife. So it was, it's small, but it was very meaningful to me. I think it was very meaningful to Ted as well.
Do you feel like doing that kind of gave you closure for the whole situation and coming to an end of this, like you finding her?
Yeah, it did. It did. There were a lot of steps to learn the entire story,
Yeah.
but it really was an event that kind of closed the story. There's still a couple of open issues out there, more on my part than on my mother's, but yeah, that brought closure to it, and it meant a lot to me.
Yeah, I could imagine. I mean, you had mentioned how, like, in the beginning, you didn't really feel like you had the need to find her and learn about your past because you grew up thinking that you, or knowing that you were adopted, but you didn't really have a desire. But do you think that, like, kind of starting that process and going through that process, you became slightly, like, more intrigued, and like, you kinda had, like, a need to want to know more?
Well, the need was fed by learning that she was not that woman who wound up at the Five and Dime or the
Right.
post office. As I said, if I had found out that, she placed me for adoption and 5 years later had a family and, then went, and married the local plumber, that would have been enough for me.
Right,
That,
right.
that would have told me, I think, pretty much what her life was about. When I found that first thing that said artista, that kind of opened the door and said, I need to know what kind of artista. And as I each, it was like tracking down a trail of breadcrumbs. And each door that I opened up just opened up another door.
Wow. So, this kind of led to you writing the book. When did you start writing the book?
I actually started writing very early in the process as I started, the book starts with that visit to the cemetery in New Jersey in 2017. And I started writing it just as a memoir, or to record my to record the search.
Okay.
Yeah, here's what I did. Here's what I did next. Here's what I did. Here's what I did next. And as I was doing that, and as I was starting to discover things, both my wife and a good friend of mine who is a published author of several books kept on saying, "You really need to write a book," because her story was getting more and more interesting the farther I dug in. So I started recording each piece of what I discovered as a result of my search. And ultimately I had my memoir, and I also had something that could have probably independently turned into a story of my mother from the time she left home in 1942. She was 17 years old
Wow.
to go pursuing her career, and she traveled across the country from New York City to Vancouver, British Columbia, all alone,
Wow.
to the time she returned and managed the pregnancy and managed my adoption pretty much in total secret. Her family never knew. So that would have been a story in itself. When I sent these two stacks to my editor, she came back and said, my suggestion is you kind of interleave them. You had your first part in New Jersey, and then you came back and you went to the library, and here's what you found out about your mother. Put that in there. And after you found this out about your mother, here's what you did. Here's what you found out. Put that next piece in there. And it's kind of like shuffling a deck of cards and interleaving all these pieces, and it wound up to be a very good flow to the story. And it closed, every piece, would bring something up, and then would give the answer. It'd bring the next piece up, provide that next answer.
Wow. I mean, just listening to you share the story gives me, like, chills knowing that you that you were able to, I mean, because 'cause I've gone through this process, so I
Yeah.
understand what it's like. But, like, to know, like, how things kinda fell in place for you, and to, like, have you walk me through your story, I felt like I was there with you. And you're extremely good at, painting a picture of everything that happened.
Well,
Do you
thank you. That's a
Ye
compliment. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I'm going to order your book just because, like, I wanna read it now. Um, but do you I mean, I think we've mentioned this before, but do you think that your story could possibly be a film?
And it could. Yeah, I think the story of my mother could be a film. And a number of people have said that, this needs to be a movie. And, everybody who writes a book thinks their book needs to be a movie. But I think she led a very interesting life. And I think I just walked away with such profound respect for her and, for what the decision she made to, to place me for adoption, and, and I think what she carried with her after she did that.
Yeah. Do you think
So
that she had some sort of shame or guilt, attached to possibly giving you up?
absolutely. It's interesting, and I've said this before. It If somebody before I wrote this book said, "Tell me what you think adoption is about," I would have said, "I think adoption is about a woman not being able or not wanting to care for the child that she's about to give birth to, passing that child off to another person, and then going on about her life." And the more I investigated my mother's story, and the more I wrote and the closer I got to it, I realized that that's not the case for any mother. I think there's emotion, and I think just mental. I sort of stay away from trauma, but yeah,
Mhm.
very strong emotion in arriving at that decision.
Yeah.
I think there's got to be trauma of some level in either, physically saying, "Here's my baby, take good care of him," or walking away and never seeing that baby. And then afterwards, lots of emotion involved. I'm actually writing a second book now, and it's about my mother's life from the time she relinquished me to the time she finds out that she's pregnant with her first son by that marriage. And in writing that book, I've done a lot of research, and I've been really blessed that I've made contact with a lot or a lot of a significant number of women from the 1950s and the 1960s who were birth mothers who relinquished children. And they've been very open in telling me what those emotions were afterwards, and how they dealt with them. And
What did they say?
there's embarrassment, there's shame, there's humiliation, there's anger, there's ambivalence, there's sorrow, and mixing and matching, or taking into account different words. The emotions are standard woman to woman to woman.
Right.
There was not one who said, "I gave up my baby, I walked away and went on with my life."
Mhm.
Most of them said, "I gave up my baby and I went on with my life, but I never, never, never shed those emotions." Now, some of them, were consumed by those emotions. There was not a day that went by.
Yeah.
Others said, once a year, whether it was a birthday or Christmas, it would hit me like a ton of bricks, but then I was good for another year. So I walked away with this, with profound respect for birth mothers, for women who relinquish children for adoption.
This was also during a time where it was extremely shameful to have a child out of wedlock.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And
This is like the very first part of the baby scoop era. And in the baby scoop era, they used to take these girls, send them off somewhere, and make some excuse for where they've been, and then take the babies away and just put them into the adoption system. And my mother, through her focus, and I think her moral compass, and the fact that she had resources to manage the pregnancy, did something totally, totally different for me. My adoption was privately arranged, and she kind of dictated this is what I want the adoptive parents to be able to provide my child.
mm.
And amazingly, she should have this should have been a lottery back then.
Yeah, I mean, and then I wanna go back to, like, the shame and the guilt part of all of that in that era because, that's something that, like, back then, they didn't have the resources available to provide the mental health help that, for people. They didn't have I don't even know if did they really have therapy back then?
Mm, I think there was therapy on a global level, but I think people who went for therapy were seen as being
Crazy?
mentally ill.
Right.
Yeah, you went
Yes.
to go to see a therapist because something was wrong with you, not to help you
Right, an issue
deal with
that
a
you
situation.
right. Wow. Yeah, I
And,
can imagine what that
certainly there was nothing for adoptive parents to, to say, here's what you're going to deal with. And I think my adoptive parents probably in the grand scheme of things were dealt the best hand possible. Shortly before my wife and I married, my adoptive mother, in conversation with my wife, just broached the fact that I was adopted.
oh, wow.
And she never broached it with me. But what she told my wife was, when we picked up Edward, the doctor told us what you need to do is you hold your baby and just over and over and over, you tell them that you're our wonderful adopted baby and we love you.
Wow.
And knowing who my mother was, I know she did that, but somehow she managed to stop it the day before I had any recollection of her doing that. I'm sure she did it, and
I'm sure she
but
didn't want you to know any different. She probably didn't want you to look at her any differently.
no, no. It's interesting. I had a conversation the other day with a friend who has a an adopted son who's 40 years old, and he adopted him at 8 months, and it was I guess it was kind of a hybrid of an open adoption in that everyone seemed to know everyone. But the physician that they brought the child to basically said, my recommendation is you don't bring up the fact that he's adopted, but should the question ever arise, you tell him everything.
Mm.
And he said somewhere, he probably around the same era where I became aware. He said the child came and said, "I'm adopted. Somebody said so." And he and his wife sat him down. They had the conversation,
Wow.
and it worked out fine. Yeah, they loved the hell out of him, and
So
interestingly, he just had a 40th birthday party down here,
oh, wow.
and he went to. I guess he's got a private plane. He flew to New Jersey, flew his half brother down to join the celebration, and his birth father came down and joined the celebration as well.
Wow. Wow.
So if there are lots of these things that don't work, and some work amazingly well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, not being a part of, I guess, that community of people that were adopted or whatever, but clearly you're a part of it now.
Yes, I
What
am.
what is that like? What is it like to be in a community of people that you kind of just happen to fall into?
Yeah, yeah. I wrote the book, and yet if you talk to people who are involved with writing books, the advice they always give is know who your audience is. But I didn't write it for anyone else. I really wrote it because it was my story. But as I came to it being published, I started thinking, okay, I've written a book, I published a book. Who do I sell it to? There's expense involved, and how do I make some of this money back?
Right.
And my first thought was, while I'm an adoptee, the real heart of this story is about my mother. She was an ice skater, and she skated in the big ice skating spectaculars in the 1940s and 1950s. I'm going to go look for those people. They will be excited to hear about this book.
Mm.
What I found out is most of the people who were her peers, and I shouldn't generalize, but many were already deceased.
Right.
Yeah, the remaining number, there was some excitement amongst a very small audience of people. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, well, where do I go next? I said, okay, I'm an adoptee. I bet there are adoptees out there who might be interested. And I got online and I started looking, thinking, maybe there's an adoptee group locally where people get together and talk about their wonderful adoption experience. And I found out that there was not. But what I found were any number of adoption support groups. And I think support became the operative word. And most of those people were looking for healing over experiences did not go nearly so well as mine. And I reached out and I found welcome in some quarters. And in some quarters, I found, quite vocalized resentment to the fact that I had a good experience.
Mm.
And, my initial thought was I'm going to bang my head against this and try to break down those doors. And then I slowly realized I never denied those people their experiences, but I found that there were certain places it just did not pay to go and try to have that discussion because it
I think
was
I think a
it was
lot of those I'm sorry.
go.
Uh, I think a lot of those people have, built up resentment, and it's probably out of frustration of not having a successful experience on trying to
Sure, sure.
people. And then also you have the trauma and everything that they had gone through maybe prior to being adopted or going into the foster care system, whatever it was. And unfortunately, those are just sad people that need help.
Yeah, and David, you could be one of those people given your experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you and I are having a very constructive conversation, and yeah, you're interested in my good experience, and I'm very grateful for that. You know, I I've recorded with other folks, and they've had experiences different than mine, but they're curious, and if anything, they want to know, how do you make adoption better for other people?
I think it's that, and then it also offers a sense of hope to people, like, maybe that are even searching for they're in the process of searching. It offers hope to know that, "Oh, okay, well, maybe there's still hope that I can find that person, or maybe there's still hope that I can still there's other leads out there at some point," or whatever. Your story is
Yeah,
a story of hope.
yeah, I think there are two things. One is, it's the family search process, and there's always hope there. The other part that they always talk about is if you're going to go into a family search, go in with an open and sympathetic mind. You know, don't go looking for the person who victimized you.
Mm,
Go in looking for the story, and maybe there's something there that you didn't know or you may not have understood by someone else's telling you about it.
right.
I think, it's just don't go looking to beat up on people, and I think we beat up on ourselves too. Be kind to yourself.
Absolutely. Now, your book is out and available, and you're currently writing a second book. I wanna pull it up on the screen real quick, your website. Um, where can people find your book?
Well, the book is available on the website, and it's available in a number of formats now. It's in soft cover, hardcover, large print, and an ebook as well. And uh, ordered through the website via credit card. I'm happy to sign it and personalize it, and they typically go out in the postage the same day. Um, it's available on all of the online retailers. All of your local bookstores should be able to to order it if they don't have it on the shelf. And if you don't want to invest in the purchase of the book, it's available in many libraries. Detroit was actually one of the first libraries that put it on the shelf, and it's also available in ebook format, either for purchase or borrowed through your library. So
Oh.
it's readily available out there.
So you can get it on like the apps, like the library apps.
Yeah, there's both Overdrive, or they call it Libby now, and
Yeah.
there's another one that's called Hoopla, and
How
you
does
could
that how does that work with being a somebody who wrote a book? Do you get paid for that?
yeah, you get paid a small amount of money, on every view of the book.
Okay, so
Uh,
it would be better if somebody bought the book.
it, it's more lucrative if someone bought the book, and honestly, since you've asked the question, it's better if somebody buys it directly from me than
Okay.
if they go to an Amazon.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
glad that information's out there.
yeah, yeah.
Because I would rather support you than somebody else.
Well, I appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. Ed, I love your story. Your story is amazing, and I honestly wish that we could be having this conversation face to face, and maybe we wouldn't have had the technical issues that we had.
Maybe
But
someday, you never know.
someday, and I know that you do like you kind of do book tours and stuff. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do library visits, I do book club visits, so if anyone out there is a member of a book club, I'd be happy to join via Zoom. Detroit's probably, or, Lansing, I'm sorry, is probably too far to go, but, but having said that, I'll be traveling to Augusta, Georgia in March to do a talk down there, and I've been as far away as Houston, Texas. So,
Wow.
I never say never, but you can
Awesome.
reach out via my website, or, my email address is edward.degangi.author at
Okay.
gmail.com.
Awesome. And the link to buy your book, your website, your email, all that will be in. You have social media, correct?
I certainly do. Yeah, on Facebook and Instagram.
Okay. I'll be sure to follow you on Instagram. I don't think I do, but your social media will be in the show notes as well.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
your story, I love it. It's an amazing story, and I hope to see a film in the future. But I'm really looking forward to reading the book, and I'm looking forward to reading the second book too when you're done with that.
I
Um,
appreciate the support, Dave. This has been a great conversation.
Absolutely, and thanks again for doing it. And this has been fun. I look forward to doing it again.
Very good. I look forward to it as well.
All right, thank you.